Since the last video on the Falmouth line, there have been a couple very interesting developments. Just this past week, the Falmouth Planning Board voted unanimously to send a letter to state officials in support of retaining the Falmouth Secondary Rail Line. While this doesn't end the rail trail groups advocating or mean a hard no to removal of the tracks, it is relieving to see some common sense prevail. The board cited removing transportation infrastructure was not a good idea. They also noted the current use of the line to transport waste off Cape without the use of trucks, which results in less carbon emissions. Putting more trucks on the road was, quote, unconscionable. Later, they noted that the rail trail groups claimed that the line could never be used for commuter rail was false, as Falmouth's own state rep Dylan Fernandes is pushing for legislation to make that happen. The line can play an extremely important role as another mode of transportation when the road bridges over the Cape Cod Canal need to be replaced. There's already plenty of traffic during the summer, and still traffic in the off-season when maintenance requires lane closures, creating an even worse bottleneck. Of course, the board has run into opposition from the trail advocates, but I don't see them being influenced by them enough to change the viewpoint that critical infrastructure needs to stay. At this point, it is also important to note that the trail advocates have coined the phrase, pull up the tracks, which just goes to show what their real goal is. In other news, State Rep Dylan Fernandes, representing Falmouth, and other state reps are pushing legislation to make commuter rail on the Cape a reality. Announced on August 30th, 2023, the legislation aims to bring commuter rail to the towns of Falmouth, Bourne, Barnstable, Sandwich, Yarmouth, and Hyannis. Interestingly enough, the Falmouth Secondary Line is not referred to as the Falmouth Line in the official legislation. It's actually called the Woods Hole Branch Line, but they don't elaborate on that, but it could be hinting at something. The text also mentions first and last mile connections within the Cape Cod rail system, including Cape-only train routes. So it takes into account needing connections and not just dropping people off in any location. Perhaps one connection could be to the Steamship Authority buses at Falmouth Station, or as implied by the name, Woods Hole Branch Line, direct connections to the ferries at Woods Hole. I wouldn't get ahead of ourselves here, but it would most certainly be something to be able to take the train right into Woods Hole instead of having to change mode of transportation every few minutes. You'll be able to just walk from the train platform to the ferry slip. Commuter train service has not run on any part of the Falmouth line since 1959, although there were some limited seasonal operations in the 1960s and again in the 80s. The old colony service cuts in the 1950s by the New Haven Railroad have been restored in some places already, like on the Greenbush, Plymouth, Kingston, and Middleborough lines, as well as the South Coast Rail Project, which will likely open next year. This all proves that passenger rail restoration is certainly possible on Cape Cod, as it has already happened in other parts of Massachusetts. Of note, most of the lines mentioned above have retained trackage in some form all these years, but they have completely replaced lines that disappeared in the 1970s. The Greenbush line had a section of track retained for use to connect to the Four River Railroad in Quincy, and the Bay Colony operated some trackage into Hingham in the 1980s, but the line below these points was removed some years prior. Similar to the Woods Hole branch, the track to the most southern point of the Greenbush was removed in the 1970s, prior to state ownership of the right-of-way and remaining track. Despite the removal, track was laid back down and service was restored in 2007, and commuter trains continue to operate on the line to this day. Of course, it is easier to simply upgrade existing track, which is why the remaining section of the Falmouth line needs to be saved. These previous projects above show that one day we might get trains rolling on the Cape again. Stay tuned for future updates to see what progress is made on the efforts to save the Falmouth line. Also, take a look at the video description below to read up on news articles and the legislation explained in this video.